You never forget the smell of smoke when it's your own house that's burning. I remember standing in the driveway, barefoot, holding nothing but my car keys, as the flames roared louder than anything I'd ever heard before. My wife clutched my arm, tears streaming down her face, while my kids stood in shock, their eyes wide and frozen on the fire that was swallowing everything we had built. I could feel the heat singeing my skin even from a distance, and the only thought racing through my head was, this is it. Everything is gone. The fire department was already there, hoses blasting against the inferno, but it was no use. The house went up in flames so fast it was like it had been waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, some recording videos, some whispering, others just staring at the chaos. I could hear fragments of their voices. Was anyone inside? Oh my God, the whole place is gone. That poor family. But all I could do was stare, frozen, at the collapsing roof, at the smoke rising high into the night sky, and at the memories being devoured one by one. Every corner of that house held a piece of our lives. The baby photos tucked into the living room drawers, the baseball glove my son used to carry everywhere, the quilt my grandmother made for me that we kept at the foot of our bed, and now it was all turning into ash right in front of me. There's a helplessness in that moment that's hard to explain, watching everything you've ever worked for, saved for, dreamed about just vanish. I felt hollow, but then something caught my eye through the smoke and chaos. A figure standing across the street, arms crossed, lips pressed into the faintest smirk. It wasn't a firefighter. It wasn't a concerned neighbor. It wasn't even a stranger who stopped to see what was happening. It was someone I knew all too well. Karen, the president of our HOA. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Who would have the nerve to stand there with that smug expression while my family home burned to the ground? But it was her. Everybody in the neighborhood knew Karen's face. The short, sharp haircut, the stiff posture, the way she always looked like she was ready to pounce on someone for breaking a rule. And there she was, watching my house burn like she had been waiting for it to happen. I didn't say anything right then. My family was crying. The firefighters were shouting. The heat was unbearable. I pushed the thought to the back of my mind, telling myself it was just shock playing tricks on me. Surely no one, especially not Karen, would ever do something so extreme. Sure, she hated me, and sure, she had made my life miserable since the day I built that back patio. But arson? No way. Still, as I stood there, the image of her face lingered. Why was she the only one not surprised? Why was she the only one not whispering, not worried, not offering help, just staring? I didn't have answers yet, and maybe I didn't even want them in that moment. All I knew was that my family was homeless. Everything we owned had been destroyed, and I had no idea how we were going to rebuild our lives from this. Later that night, as the fire finally died down and all that was left of my home was a blackened skeleton of wood and stone, I sat on the curb with my head in my hands. I should have been thinking about insurance, about calling relatives, about finding a place to stay. But the only thing replaying in my head was the look on Karen's face, the way she stood there like she had been waiting for this night all along. I didn't know it then, but that fire wasn't just a random tragedy. It wasn't fate. It wasn't bad luck. And it wasn't some accident waiting to happen. That fire was set, and the person behind it was the very same neighbor who had spent months trying to make my life a living nightmare. Before the fire ever happened, life in that neighborhood had already become exhausting, all because of one person, Karen, the HOA president. From the very first day my family moved in, it was obvious that she took her role far too seriously. Most neighborhoods have an HOA that handles basic things like lawn maintenance or making sure the community pool is clean. But with Karen in charge, it was less like a community and more like a dictatorship. She walked around with a clipboard like she was patrolling a military base, and her favorite weapon wasn't a gun or a badge. It was her endless stack of violation notices. The first time I ever heard from her was just 2 days after we moved. I hadn't even finished unpacking the boxes yet, but there was already a letter taped to my front door. It said my trash bin had been visible for too long after pickup day. 2 days in, and I was already being fined $50. At the time, I laughed it off, thinking it was just bad luck. But as the weeks went on, the letters kept coming. My lawn was half an inch too long. My son left his basketball hoop at the end of the driveway overnight. My mailbox wasn't painted the exact same shade as the others. It was like Karen was waiting at her window with binoculars, desperate for me to slip up so she could pounce. Tried to ignore her at first. I paid the ridiculous fines, grumbled about it privately, and told my wife we just needed to play the game and she'd eventually lose interest. But the opposite happened. The more I complied, the more she escalated. It wasn't enough for her to nitpick. She wanted control. She wanted me to bend completely to her rules. It wasn't about the lawn or the trash bin. It was about power. The final straw came when I decided to build a small patio in the backyard. It wasn't anything crazy, just a little stone extension, where we could grill, eat, and let the kids play. I got the permits, I double-checked the HOA guidelines, and everything was within the rules. But the day the contractor showed up, Karen stormed right into my yard like she owned the place. Her face was red, her voice was shrill, and she shouted that the patio was unauthorized and had to be stopped immediately. I calmly explained that I had the permits, that I had checked the rules, and that she had no authority to stop me. But Karen wasn't used to people standing up to her. She was used to neighbors bowing down, scared of her constant threats. When I didn't back down, she completely lost it. She accused me of ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic, of lowering property values, and even claimed my family was disrespecting the community. I'll never forget the way she looked at me that day. Her voice dropped and she leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume. "If you don't respect this neighborhood," she hissed, "you won't be living here much longer." At the time, I brushed it off as just another one of her over-the-top threats. I told myself she was just venting her frustration, that she didn't really mean it. But in hindsight, that was the moment everything shifted. That was the moment I became her #1 target. From then on, she was relentless. The violation letters doubled. She called city inspectors on me for illegal construction, even though my patio was perfectly legal. She left nasty notes in my mailbox. She even tried to rally the other neighbors against me, convincing them that I was some kind of troublemaker who didn't belong in her neighborhood. Some neighbors believed her. Others just stayed quiet, too scared of becoming her next victim. My family felt the pressure too. My wife hated going outside because she didn't want to deal with Karen's constant glares. My kids couldn't ride their bikes without her yelling at them for being too loud. Even simple things like hosting a barbecue became stressful because we knew Karen would show up to complain. It got to the point where we didn't feel at home in our own house anymore. But as much as Karen pushed, I refused to let her win. I wasn't about to tear down a perfectly legal patio just to please her. I wasn't about to bow down to her endless harassment. I had worked too hard to build a life for my family, and I wasn't going to let a bitter HOA president dictate how we lived. What I didn't realize back then was that Karen wasn't the type of person to accept defeat. She wasn't going to stop just because her fines and complaints didn't scare me. No, Karen wanted me gone, and she was willing to take things further than anyone could have ever imagined. At the time, I thought the worst she could do was harass me with fines, phone calls, and fake complaints. I never could have guessed that just weeks later, I'd be standing in front of my burning house, remembering her threat word for word, and realizing she might have meant every single one of them. The night of the fire started out like any other Saturday. We'd gone out for dinner as a family, laughing over pizza and milkshakes, talking about weekend plans, completely unaware of the nightmare waiting for us when we got home. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd almost immediately. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air near the garage. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor had spilled fuel while mowing their lawn earlier in the day. I told myself not to overthink it, but then, before I could even step out of the car to investigate, everything happened at once. A flicker of light caught my eye through the side of the garage. Within seconds, that flicker became a roar. Flames erupted, climbing up the walls as if someone had poured accelerant everywhere. The fire spread so fast it felt impossible. One moment I was reaching for the door handle. The next I was shouting for my family to get out. As the heat pressed against the windows, we barely escaped with our lives. My wife scooped up our youngest while I dragged our older 2 kids toward the street. By the time we reached the driveway, the flames had already consumed the garage and were spreading into the living room. It was like watching a monster devour our home, each crack and collapse of wood a reminder that everything we owned was being destroyed. The fire department arrived within minutes, but even they looked shaken by how quickly the blaze had grown. Neighbors gathered, some gasping, some crying, some recording with their phones like it was just another spectacle. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, my family trembling beside me, and all I could think was how close we had come to not making it out at all. As firefighters battled the inferno, one of them eventually pulled me aside. His face was grim, his voice low, like he didn't want the others to overhear. He told me this didn't look like a normal fire. The way the flames had spread, the traces of accelerant, it all suggested arson. Someone had set this fire on purpose. The word hit me like a punch in the gut. Arson. Who would do something so evil? Who hated me enough to destroy my home, to endanger my wife and kids? I racked my brain for answers, and that's when it hit me like a lightning bolt. Karen. I remembered the way she had confronted me in the backyard just a week earlier. The way her voice dropped as she told me, "If you don't respect this neighborhood, you won't be living here much longer." At the time, I had brushed it off as an empty threat, just another power trip from a woman who thrived on control. But standing there with the smell of gasoline thick in the air and my house collapsing into ashes, her words replayed in my mind with terrifying clarity. Could she really have done this? Could the same woman who spent her days handing out fines and lecturing neighbors have escalated to something this monstrous? My rational mind wanted to deny it, to tell myself no one could be that cruel. But deep down, I already knew. Her smirk across the street as the fire raged, the way she had singled me out for months, the threats she had whispered, all of it, painted a picture I didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. The police started their investigation right away. They took statements, collected evidence, and asked if I had any idea who might want to hurt us. My mouth went dry as I said her name. Karen, the HOA president. The officer didn't flinch, didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me. He just nodded and wrote it down. That was the moment I realized my suspicion wasn't crazy. It was possible, maybe even likely. Meanwhile, my kids were sobbing, clutching each other in the cold night air, their faces streaked with soot and tears. My wife was shaking, whispering over and over that we had lost everything. And she was right. We didn't even have pajamas, toothbrushes, or shoes. The fire had taken it all. Standing in the ashes of my life, I should have been focused on finding a hotel, calling insurance, figuring out how we'd survive the next few days. But instead, my mind kept circling back to Karen, her voice, her glare, her smug little smirk. I couldn't get rid of it. And for the first time in my life, I realized I might not just be dealing with a difficult neighbor. I might be up against someone truly dangerous. The days after the fire blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, grief and disbelief. Insurance adjusters came and went. The smell of smoke clung to our clothes and hair, even after we left the wreckage behind. My kids didn't want to sleep alone anymore, and my wife woke up at every little sound, convinced the flames were coming back. But while we were trying to pick up the pieces of our lives, the police were quietly piecing together something far more disturbing. The fire hadn't just been suspicious, it had been deliberate. At first, they didn't tell me much. They said they were investigating, that they'd be in touch. But then, just a few days later, one of the detectives called and asked me to come down to the station. When I walked in, he slid a photo across the table. It was grainy security footage from a neighbor's street camera, but the car was unmistakable. Karen's, parked just a few houses down from mine less than an hour before the fire broke out. I stared at that picture, my heart pounding. The detective's voice was calm as he explained what they had found. Multiple witnesses had seen her. In the area that night, some even said they noticed her carrying a red gas can. Investigators confirmed accelerant had been poured around the garage. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't a freak accident. Someone had stood there and lit the match that destroyed my home. And the evidence pointed straight at her. Hearing it confirmed didn't bring relief. It brought rage. This woman had spent months tormenting me with fines, complaints, and threats. I thought the worst she could do was make my life inconvenient. But she'd taken it further than anyone could imagine. She had tried to erase everything I loved in one night. And worst of all, she didn't just risk my belongings, she risked my family's lives. If we had come home even 10 minutes later, or if the fire had started while we were asleep inside, we wouldn't have made it out. The police didn't waste time. Karen was arrested at her home, and when word spread through the neighborhood, people couldn't believe it. Some were shocked, some pretended they weren't surprised, and others admitted they'd always thought she had a mean streak. But no one expected this. She was charged with arson, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. Watching the patrol car pull away with her in the back seat should have felt like victory, but all I felt was numb. What happened next was something I never could have scripted. A week after the fire, I walked into a courtroom for the arraignment. I wasn't just there as the victim, I was there as a lawyer. And when they brought her in, handcuffed, wearing that orange jumpsuit, our eyes met. The same woman who stood smugly on the street as my house burned was now standing before me in chains. The look on her face when she realized I was sitting at the prosecutor's table was something I'll never forget. For once the power was gone from her eyes. Karen's attorney tried to spin the story, claiming she was being framed, that the footage didn't prove anything, that the witnesses were mistaken. But the evidence was overwhelming. The gas residue on her clothes, the testimony from neighbors who had overheard her threats, the very words she had hissed at me weeks earlier about not living in the neighborhood much longer, came back to haunt her. Every piece fit together, and no matter how hard her lawyer argued, it was clear the jury wasn't buying it. Sitting there, I thought about all the times she had tried to intimidate me, all the fines, the letters, the shouting matches. She had built herself up into this self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, believing she was untouchable. And now, here she was, facing the consequences of every single choice she had made. What struck me the most wasn't the evidence, or even the guilty looks exchanged between her and her lawyer. It was the silence of the neighbors sitting in the gallery. The same people who used to avoid standing up to her, who lived in fear of her wrath, were now watching her fall. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other, and a few looked at me with regret, as if they wished they had spoken up sooner. I realized then that this wasn't just about my house. This was about years of control, intimidation, and abuse finally catching up with her. She hadn't just tried to destroy my family. She had terrorized the entire neighborhood, and now, for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. The trial dragged on for weeks, but every single day it felt like justice was inching closer. The evidence piled up higher than even I expected. There was the security footage of her car, the gas can she had hastily ditched in a neighbor's trash bin, the chemical traces on her clothes, and even her own words, the threats she had thrown at me in front of multiple witnesses. The defense tried everything. They painted her as a misunderstood community leader, a woman who only cared about protecting the neighborhood. But how could anyone believe that when the proof was right there? Protecting the neighborhood doesn't mean pouring gasoline around a family's garage and lighting a match. When I took the stand, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do. I wasn't just testifying as a victim, I was reliving every moment of that night. I described the smell of gasoline, the sudden roar of flames, the way I barely got my kids out in time. I spoke about how my youngest still woke up screaming from nightmares, how my wife flinched at the sound of sirens, how the loss of every photograph, every piece of our history, cut deeper than anyone could see. I wanted the jury to feel it, to Understand that this wasn't just property damage. This was trauma that would scar us forever. And then, the prosecutor played a recording taken by one of my neighbors. They had captured Karen ranting just days before the fire. On the recording, you could hear her voice, sharp and venomous, saying, "If he thinks he can defy me, he'll regret ever moving here." The courtroom went dead silent. Karen's attorney objected, tried to argue it was taken out of context, but the damage was done. Everyone in that room heard it. Her own words had betrayed her. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they came back, their faces were set, their decision written all over them. Guilty, on every count. I don't think I breathed until the words were read out loud. Guilty of arson. Guilty of destruction of property. Guilty of reckless endangerment. Guilty of trying to destroy everything I held dear. Karen's face in that moment was something I'll never forget. The smugness she had worn for years was gone. The woman who once strutted around the neighborhood like she was untouchable now looked small, terrified, and completely powerless. She was sentenced to years in prison, with no chance of early release. And just like that, the reign of HOA Karen was over. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. Without her constant surveillance and threats, people began to breathe easier. Neighbors who had once ignored me or even sided with her came forward, apologizing for staying quiet. They admitted they had been afraid to stand up to her, that they had let her bully them into silence, and while part of me wanted to be angry at them for not speaking out sooner, another part of me understood. Karen had ruled with fear, and fear is a powerful weapon. Rebuilding our home was a long and painful process, but it became more than just a construction project. It became a symbol of resilience, a promise to my family that no one, not even someone as ruthless as Karen, could take away our future. Every brick laid, every wall painted, every room rebuilt was a reminder that we had survived, that we were stronger than what had tried to destroy us. And when we finally moved back in, it wasn't just a house. It was proof. Proof that justice works, proof that we could overcome even the worst betrayal, and proof that people like Karen don't get to win in the end. My kids laughed again, my wife smiled again, and for the first time in months I felt peace. Sometimes when I walk past the new patio in the backyard, the very thing that sparked her obsession, I think back to that threat she made. "You won't be living here much longer." She had tried to make good on those words, but in the end, she was the one who lost everything. Not me. Karen thought she could control the neighborhood, thought she could control me, thought she could play God with other people's lives. But all she did was dig her own grave. And as she sits behind bars serving out the sentence she earned, I sit with my family in a home full of love, laughter, and strength. The house may have burned, but we came out of the fire unbroken.